Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, that is. My channel is called Discerning What is True. Today is the 15th day of January 2024, and going to be reading a particular chapter, chapter 10, from the book called The Shadow of the Third Century by Alvin Boyd Kuhn, which I've read quite a few of his works. And the title of the chapter 10 is called The Great Ebb Tide. So appreciate you being here. Hope you have ears to hear, eyes to see, and have the wisdom to discern what is true. So thank you for being here again. Like I said, we're going to be reading this particular chapter at this moment. So hold on just a second here as I try to get this thing working as it should be. It was just fine a minute ago. Okay. All right, here we go. The great ebb tide. At last, then, the long buried truth emerges to view. Christianity was not a movement generated by a wholly new revelation of light, Light, much less of the first light kindled out of heaven to end previous earthly darkness. On the contrary, it was a popular, sweet, violent reaction that dragged truly sacred, esoteric wisdom out of its attic and inner sanctum and prevailed in wholesale to the people at large. However, heroic in its motive to disclose the secret knowledge to the poor, it was historically fatal in its consequences, where it contravened, ignored, and violated the inexorable ordinance of life that man can appropriate only what he has won and can utilize beneficially only what he can handle with the sure precision of intelligence. Christianity's much lauded gift of religion to the submerged group ended by perpetuating and deepening that submersion for 17 centuries. The innumerable manufactured tradition The innumerable manufactured tradition that Christianity arose from a sudden outburst of new light in the heathen gloom and one of the most outlandish fabrications in the course of all human arrogancy. The claim of such a origin for this religion flies in direct contradiction of all the implacable laws that govern the evolution of movements in human society. The notion universally prevailed by Christian writers is that the religion sprang from no roots grounded in the past and owed nothing to the past. This is asserted to be true in spite of the fact that many books, as shall be noticed, to omit the adoption of much pagan or antecedent material into the Christian constitution. For each, when such appropriation is omitted, the position is still always maintained that the Christians converted what it borrowed into its first relevant meaning and utility, and thus redeemed it from a senseless void among the heathen in a high usage and import. The dogmatic plea is that Christians took up some of the old forms and doctrines of pagan uses and for the first time invested them with the dignity of a true meaning and dynamic good force. Assertions to this effect abound. This is another of those many canaries invented by the Christians that are as baseless as they are disingenuous. It is sadly enough true that the light of inner significance of most of the ancient mystery practices and formulated had gone out or dimmed low before Christianity had its inception, but that the new religion, which soon agitated the popular mind, took up features though whose esoteric sense had vanished and restored them to the lost deeper significance, is as bald a falsehood as ever insinuated itself into the most depraved minds. The astonishing truth is almost the direct contrary of this. For the most part, it was the Christians who inherited past forms and liturgy, pushed out of focus or lost every last vestige of a nobler esoteric interpretation, and substituted for that truer understanding their own gross literal or historical rendering. At any rate, when the body of ancient mythical and ritualistic presentments had passed through the ringer, so to say, of the process of revamping at Christian hands, it emerged stripped bare of any remaining esoteric significance. The charge that the pagans had enacted rites and mouthed doctrines in entire ignorance of a noble sense behind them, and that the Christians elevated all this material to lofty sublimity and saving intelligence. And it's quite the opposite of the truth. It has been shown that the very efforts made by Origen, Clement, and to some degree Augustine to do something in this direction was violently repudiated by the church, and similar effects have been summarily smothered ever since. The most determined search is unable to find any authentic evidence that Christianity at any point instituted any improvements over pagan things. Rather at every turn it registered a movement from intelligence to ignorance, from better to worse, from lofty conceptions to degradation. Yeah, I would say that Christianity, the leaders who were involved in this, did a really good snow job on the people. They basically, they really actually pumped up this whole idea of Christianity, and basically, it was basically a snow job. And unfortunately, majority, no, not the majority, the overwhelming percentage of people rather believe in the literal the particular perspective out there, because everyone else believes in it. You see, that's part of the crowd mentality too. It's a psychological bent also. Anyway, the attempt to set forth in clear light the generating costs of Christianity, more properly, of course, Christianism, required the making of a preliminary survey of the status of affairs in religion and culture prevailing before its birth. For this moment took its rise immediately out of the play of forces operative at the time and was not the product of revelation from spiritual heavens. It is the assumption that it was a new effigies of celestial life that had prevented the attempt to explain it on the usual grounds of historical influences at work in background and environment. It was definitely an earth-born surge of religious feelings than any in history. Indeed, it was less heaven-born than most, in the sense that a stir in general among the ignorant is less, quote unquote, divine than one generated in the upper ranges of intelligence. Assuredly, Christianity grew out of the religious situation of its day and its past. That situation must be scrutinized with regard to its actualities and a scrupulous exclusivity of truth-telling, apparently, and according to it before. The background screen against which it is all to be thrown is, of course, the rule of the esoteric spirit, the true custodian of culture, as outlined here, intelligence and a passionate love of truth for its own sake, or, quote, divine philosophy, end quote. As the Greeks denominated it, exercised its rightful hegemony over the fields of thought, sending its benign rays as far down from the apex of eagle-eye apperception as it was able to penetrate into the area of the general mind. Veiled it in myth, allegory, and symbol, and other arcane forces, and kept it pretty strict secretly. It reached only a select group of the best qualified. Nevertheless, the inveterate bent of the masses to apt or respect the aristocracy of wealth, position, or intelligence provided a bridge, narrow enough, no doubt, by which some of the aura and the beneficence of culture could pass down to the masses. In the face of Christian statements to the contrary, it must be affirmed that the cultivation of esoteric wisdom by the intellectual aristocrats, or the aristocracy, in the pagan world did not lead the masses in such destitution of sane and balanced views of religion as has always been alleged. General standings of thought and understanding were high, much higher in such a land as Greece. Let's see, where was that? Greece here. Than they were when the philosophical interests got out of hand. slipped from the control of the few and ran their rampant course among the people. At least it is evident from history itself that while the Hellenic philosophical culture dominated the scene, there is not to be found anything comparably to the emotional extravagance of religious pietism and violence of religious fanaticism that came with the Christian upsurge. If, as is recorded, as many as 30,000 people assembled to witness certain of the dramatic representations produced in the celebration of the festivals of the Eleusinian mysteries, it is evidence that the influence of the few intellectuals was both powerful and edifying generally. All, of course, depended upon the mental development of the people themselves as to how far and how beneficially the arcane wisdom propagated by the secret brotherhoods could penetrate and leaven the mass mind. It is legitimate to contend that it is the so-called upper class of society is highly enlightened with a true and elevating philosophy. The people beneath cannot utterly fail to be benefit. A society which can produce Plato and Aristotle must itself be permanently by their light. When vision does not when vision does not fail, the people will not perish. Christianity, this work's claims, was produced by a force and a spirit that found expression and character under the influences that prevailed when vision had failed. That failure of vision, its causes and consequences must now be canvassed, that is. Christianity surged forth when a lamentable and tragic recession of a high tide, perhaps the very highest tide in the period of known history of a philosophical culture that is still the brightest glory of human civilization, had reached the nadir of its cycle. Among the most informing of all studies should be the effort to account for the failure of high development after touching the apex of its advance. In the dare of exact knowledge of this phenomenon, resort must be had to be the broad principle that human culture, like everything else in the life movement, advances cynically, randomly, or in waves. It rises high and sinks back. It crests from and back breaks at the given point. They do not run steadily in the same form. Like the surf on the beach, they gather their forces, take their form, spend their energy in one climatic surge, and die away. Randomly, another follows. The streets of Athens are devoid of groups listening to Socrates now. The study of Florence harbored no mighty artists or humanists now. The inns of London toast no Shakespeare. Dr. Johnson's, Boswell's, Goldsmith's, Wordsworth's, layman England's need of a Milton. Even Concord is silent without the oracle voices of Emerson, Thoreau, and Hawthorne. Culture surges to heights, then recedes. Brilliance does not reproduce itself. Culture is not static. What is to be adduced here for its weighty import is that Greek philosophy came as the common point, perhaps the highest tide of uplift in human culture, and Christianity came at and as the lowest point of the recession of that wave. It is possible to ascertain and delineate the particular features that conduce to the lofty development in the age of Perigus, as well as those that were in manifestation when the Hellenic light declined. It should be done. What lighted that lamp, and why did it not burn longer or continuously? Here indeed is the crux of the matter. The world is condemned because it did not receive the light when it came. Equally is worthy of blame for not having kept the lamp trimmed and burning once the flame was kindled. The world is always clamoring for new light. This is silly, seeing that it has not held the great light it so abundantly received of old. The glory beamed once and again, but the blind and fatal stupor of the human mind has dimmed it, lost it. There is no surety that if a Christ comes to give life to the world will either accept or if it will retain it. It has been given and renewed again and again, only to die out as often. A significant saying of the Lord in the Hindu books is, quote, "As often as piety and religion decay among men, I send my messenger to revive them," end quote. The great age of crowning glory in philosophical culture came with Pythagoras and Plato, flared in the sky of human thought, and died out in the succeeding age. 600 years later, when the darkness had settled again over the Hellenistic world, the spiritual custodians made a supreme effort to rekindle the Platonic flame. Forth again flared the gleam and brilliance, even perhaps surpassing its original glow in the school of Ammonus Saccocus, in the writings of Polonius, Lamblisius, Porphyria, Prosus, and the esoteric successors of Philo and Neoplatonic gave the world its light again. If there is a hierarchy of spiritual counseling that exercises some supervision over the periodical cultural revivification of the world, it can be reasonably assumed that the outburst of the Platonic esotericism in the 3rd century of the Christian era was the deliberate engineering of an effort to stop the horrendous blighting of all deep wisdom by the Christian uprising, which was with sickening speed closing all minds to the impact of the spiritual mystery teaching. As it descended from the lofty apprehensive of myth and allegory to blunt dead literalism of the scriptural word, but too late it came, and the horrid debauchery crashed to its full ruin. The ignorant masses had begun their march, and the voice of esoteric sanity could not make itself heard to halt them. Down into the dark ages plunged the Western world. The story of this chapter must be the descent of human culture from Platonic heights to medieval depths. This great world catalysm has hardly ever been made the subject of intensity, or at any rate enlightened study. Gibbon's great history is a sidelong approach to it. Christianity, of course, has resented its truthful exposition of its own low character, its disingenuous motivations, and its fanatic violence. But the dismayed recension of culture after Plato has not gone unnoticed. It is descended upon by numerous investigators, if in far from exhaustive and discerning treatment. But one of the most astute of modern scholars has immortalized a phrase that was hit upon by him to express the salient idea that describes the fatal decline. Readers in this field are well acquainted with Sir Gilbert Murray's famous description term for it, the failure of Greek nerve. In its broad connotation, it well characterizes what is set forth here. But its breadth is meaning needs delineation to more specific particularities. What is that Sir Gilbert wishes us to undertake in his word nerve? Is indeed a well-chosen term. It connotes such qualities as courage and self-reliance to fight out the issues of life's battles. In most central concepts, however, it is that it embraces this resolute facing of life struggles and reliance upon the resources within the scope of man's own nature and constitution, without falling back upon extravagant aids or depending upon what might be called a subsidy from a power entirely outside man's prerogative. To keep this stout, that is nerve, end quote, philosophically speaking, was to fight the good fight in the might of his human wisdom, guided and enlightened by the diviner wisdom, Germanically resident and potentially perfectible within its own sphere of consciousness and direction. This, quote, nerve held men fast to the high and true philosophical ideas of waging the, quote unquote, Armageddon battle of their evolution on the terms set as conditions by life and deity themselves, demanding the exercise that would bring the unfoldment of those interpotentialities of insight and knowledge that must govern the growth of the whole man in the end, not to use them, but to let them lie untried and unproven while looking helplessly outside for help when God had placed that sword of the Spirit immediately within man's own constitution, was to fail both man and God at the only point at which God's superpower stands within man actually reach and influence. To abandon or to fail in this resolution is to stand and battle with the weapons God has provided for this express contingency, and to surrender the battlefront and retreat in a mission of helplessness, and then in servile move to call upon external powers to save oneself, is what the scholar meant by the loss of nerve on the part of the Greek world. It is notable and only too true analysis of the Rudeful epoch. It was this demoralization of the human courage and elan inspired by Greek philosophy that prepared the ground for the upspringing of the fantastically degenerate Christianism. This failure of nerve, and only in Greece but elsewhere, but everywhere, should be the subject of the keenest research by all students of human currents, where it draws the rough sketch of the nature of every deterioration or backsliding of religious culture. It announces the prime criterion of all culture, since it defines culture to be the exercise, growth, and perfected beneficial use of the divine power potential in man. The moment then that the central intelligence in the human being falls so short of competent knowledge as to give over the resolution to employ and display the resources providentially made available within its reach, and to run to sources to help allegedly available outside its sphere of initiative, there is the failure of nerve and the end of self-cultural. Man in such a deplorable state resigns the lordship of the only God who can save him, and sinks in abject surrender to the mercies of elementary powers and the forces of nature. Indeed, Paul tells us that before we had risen in evolution to the point of consciousness of our own mastery of the forces drawing the chariot of our advance to deity, quote, we were in bondage to the elementals of the earth, end quote, and of the air, or the, quote, elements of the world, end quote. Divine gift of a spiritual soul linked in with our mortal components was to lift us above the subversive and helplessness under nature's law, to give us conscious command of our own growth through the awakening powers of the free spirit of truth, which should lead us into all truth. Once development set to its task of rulership, this Holy Spirit, or Paraclete, man's eternal comforter, dare not be surrendered. For man to do so is for him to surrender his divine to the power of the elementary nature in him. For it is the cosmic prerogative of the divine to rule the natural. In the realm of such mental cultures as religion and philosophy, it is to surrender understanding and knowledge to emotion, the possibility of wisdom. It happens, it's understanding and knowledge to emotions, the possibility of wisdom, and sure guidance to faith. And this surrender is what crept like a palsy over the area of Hellenic world after Plato. With philosophy and decadence, there was nowhere available the sufficient knowledge to fortify men with the courage to stand in the might of their divine donated and front life with yeoman heroism of the spirit. Man surrendered his divine sword and ran in fear and rout to God, the God not in his own selfhood, but the God in remote heavens, end quote. In conformity with the usual outcome of unintelligent religionism, the devotees abandoned earth as the place where vital values and salvation can be won, and looked and flee to heaven. The flight of religion from earth to heaven for the realization of supreme values has with never exception marked the divorcement of religion from philosophy, of faith from knowledge, and perhaps no short description can so well delineate the decline and fall of true religion as this shifting of the locale or point of focus of true values in the spiritual life of man, not to wage life engagement, but to flee it for the happier lands beyond the tomb, becomes man's objective. You see, it's beyond the tomb. The idea of heaven. This, of course, paralystic's further initiative, and with the budding flower of the soul's life. The prime objective of originally sound religion was to focus the battle for values here in the world and inside the conscious human spirit. A religion of decency, made with violence, with undisciplined emotional, and be free of philosophical knowledge, always distracts man's vision from its true objective here. Thus, all such errant religious upheavals sidetrack man from the proper road of its evolution. Leave him to wallow in the mire of his own wild propensities and stagnate his upward drive to divinity. It is true that Murray does not paint the same picture of the failure of nerve as it is here done. He sees it as a failure of hope and confidence in Greek people to achieve the better earthly life through national governments and mundane institutions. He sees it as the disillusionment of the philosophers in their dream of such realizations and their consequence retirement from the collective outward effort into the solitary seeking of spiritual comfort and contact with God in the depths of their own retreats and their own souls. It represents to Murray a abandonment of communal effort in society to institute the perfect state, such as Plato's Republic, and to elevate man as a whole and outwardly, and a withdrawal in despair from this enterprise and the seclusion of life of contemplation. It was a derision from all social brotherhood to the single chance of saving oneself. But all this is only a further extension of what our thesis presents. It was still a shift of the heft of aim and endeavor from earth to heaven. The heaven, in this case, of man's own mystical nature. Our delineation took the shift to the heaven of expectation beyond the earthly scene. For Christianity did later transfer the locus of divine realization from earth entirely, teaching its devotees to abandon hope of his here and count it assiduously for the life to come. Yes, indeed. Yes, very much so. The failure of nerve was real enough both in Murray's analysis and in ours. The downfall of Christianity came in the form and feature of a surrender of philosophy to religion. It is a parallel phenomenon in the life of a nation, race, or age to the similar manifestations in the life of an individual. Indeed, it is the reduplication on a collective scale of a change of attitude that nearly every person goes through in his intellectual growth in a lifetime. In youth, the mind looks forward to the dreams and possibilities of actual worldly achievement. Plans are made to accomplish many things. Ideal goals are set as attainment. It seems to youth that ideal programs of reform and advance can be carried through to success if only people will unite and affect them. A philosopher points the way and charts the principle of right action. The mind stakes all on such a philosophy and loyalty and sincerely commit the individual to action for it. But age changed the tune. Hope, confident wane as time goes on, and the expositions of the stolidity, the weakness, and the treachery of humans in the mass weight down in the sanguine spirit. At last, courage is shattered by doubt, fear, disappointment. The stout heart quakes. The nerve fails. The individual surrenders the fight and falls back on God, his private refuge. We are witnessing of this turn back to religion of one after another notable persons, not to mention thousands of lesser ones, is quite accurately and scientifically described as an aspect of a real second childhood, end quote. Middle manhood makes a valiant effort to achieve success under its own power, on its own resources. The effort being generally thought a failure and personally strength waning, the individual reverts back into the mental trust in a higher power that was the native instinct of childhood. Then it was unconscious. Now it is not only conscious but rationalized. If the child leaves his father's house or migrating to earth and forgets his paternal home after childhood, he just as naturally turns back to it nears the end of his journey abroad. It is the homing instinct, a divine nostalgia. In the Persian age, the soul of Greece ventured heroically to achieve the good life by means of his own great genius and insight, and it picked up the true keys from Egypt. It strove with courage and clear vision to chart the course of action that would achieve the good life among human generally. No historical effort to this end was ever better grounded, but it was like the high moment of inspiration of the artist, the poet, the diviner of beauty. It could not be sustained at high-pitched overload. The delicate pose and harmony of the elements of body, mind, and soul requisites to channel smoothly and powerfully the forces of such an exaltation cannot be held indefinitely. New souls enter who change the rhythm and precipitate discords. The glow of genius, the flame of the divine, dies away to be replaced by a lower and less beautiful expression. The tension is too high to hold long. The soul takes refuge again for a time in mediocrity. So the great age of philosophy of the divine illumination faded out after Plato. The Mid-East world, the Hellenistic people, saw the light grow dim. The divine child of Christly genius was again to be threatened with being devoured by the reptile or brutish ignorance and dull human inertia. Sut was to win another victory over Horus. Saturn was to grim motley at the Christos on earth mound of temptation. And what might the dragon of darkness breed in the time of his triumph? What monstrous prodigy of diabolical frenzy might it now generate? What hybrid, offspring of the incessant mating of faith and folly, might it not bring forth, like the horrid Minotaur, fathered by animal passion and mothered by natural instinct? The decline of enrooted philosophy took the divine principle out of the human compound and left man to wallow in his own bootless groping, or to throw himself abjectly on the mercies of an eternal deity. Man threw up his hands, abandoned his job of self-evolution, ignored the God within his own being, and ran helplessly like a child back to the Heavenly Father. Vision had again failed, and the people were destined to perish in an age of darkness. For the monstrous product of a union of faith and ignorance was to come forth in the form of a misshapen creature, whose brutal power over the Western millions for 20 centuries was destined to derationalize the human mind with morbid hallucinations beyond belief. In a notable passage in the National Genius, that is Volume 2, page 497, Massey asks how it was that the religion of the ignorant overturned and superseded that of the learned. He attributed it chiefly to the secrecy and exclusive guardianship of the arcane wisdom. Quote, the religion of mystery was doomed to die of the secrecy in which it had been self-enshrined. It was buried alive with its own seal on its own mouth. It was an unpublished religion. End quote. This factor played some part, no doubt. It deprived the people of assumed good and initiated them. Still, secretly, had not killed the Masonic order, and the Christian ecclesiastic system had maintained its place and influence largely by keeping in scriptures and its history and most esoteric policy a secret from its own members. Secrecy is only a facade of a more adequate answer. The fuller analysis reveals that finally the intelligence failed that might have kept arcane knowledge alive in philosophical schools and academies. There is required almost as much genius to perpetuate a flashing measure to originate it. The Platonic, the Orphic, the Hermetic wisdom is shining in the pages of books and dusty shelves at this moment. At last the vision is discerned, evaluate, it is wanting even now. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, is grievously lacking. The Bible itself, a tome rich in cosmic and anthropology truth, is to an unbounded circulation at this time. Again, at last, is still a book sealed up by the ignorance of even the theologians who pose as its founders. The mere existence of great truth in print does not by any means guarantee its assimilation by the world, its circulation in the veins of the body of world consciousness. Massey's reason is convicted of inadequacy by what he himself says in the next science that, quote, the new set put forth the same dogmas, doctrines, tenets under the same types, accompanied by the same rites and ceremonies, end quote, and thus, quote, became the first publishers of the ancient religion with a new interpretation of the Christ made flesh. The Gnostics did try to say, with the suppression hand on their mouths, quote, you are only publishing our secrets with a lying gloss put on them. But this slight protest was unheard amidst the loud clamor of the fanatical ignorant, end quote. He has said that the arcane wisdom of the Gnosis died or killed itself from the self-imposed lack of publication and dissemination. Then he tells us that the new set of Christians came along and published it, and that he claims killed it. It's a weird logic that holds that a system died both from publication and non-publication. The thesis profit here is that a publication with a false interpretation attached, killed it. What Massey's rightly has in mind, no doubt, is that the failure to publish it with a true esoteric interpretation. by which alone its continued beneficiary influences could be prolonged, led to its falling into disuniate for want of supporters and propagandists among those qualified, whereas on the other hand, a publication with, quote, with a lying gloss put upon it, end quote, by the ignorant literalizers of spiritual representations beyond their comprehension did kill it by reducing it to an innate nonsense. This republication or broadcasting to the world for the first time of the literature of the wisdom hitherto held in secrecy was the generated cause of Christianity. This is almost certainly the first time since Macy's books that this item of history has been advanced in any work essaying to print the truth of Christian origins. But it is a declaration that needs an immense and elaborate assemblage of precise, authentic data to substantiate it and vindicate it against the denials that will assail it. Even before the ink of the statement had dried, it must be added as a necessary qualification that it was the republication of the arcane or secret wisdom, not by any means in its true form of either presentation or comprehension, but pitiably caricature and mutilated by incompetent interpretation with a lying gloss put upon it that generated the sweep of erratic religionism that became Christianity. We have indeed the sharpest and most instructive contrast here before us between two movements pushing forward at nearly the same time, the one proceeding with a start at about 2 centuries over the other, but then overlapping it, the first. The Christianism, that is the second, the Neoplatonists, both publish essentially the same doctrinal system. This would be Porphyrius denied, to be sure, yet it is true, and has been since seen, hinted at, or openly admitted by many religious historians. The reason it has not been clearly evident to all is that the one Christianism presented it in a grossly garbed and misshapen form, as it had already been corrupted by vulgar unintelligence, as given out by the Christians. Its resemblance to the pristine form as Neoplatonism is almost completely obliterated. In fact, its mutilation and disfigurements has already progressed so far, the general historian is hardly to be censored for not knowing that the one was the hyperchild of the other. This work will add accumulated data to prove this contention, namely that Christianity was a resurgent of Platonic systematism, but so frankly mangled by a misconception of its interior message and decrypted language as to be unrecognizable in its lineage. The two systems really dealt with what I call essentially the same body of ancient wisdom. The one gave out a marvelous elaboration of the loftiest conceptualism possible to the human brain. It could be received in its high truth only by the best disciplined minds among the people. The other gave out the mere husk or shell in the mighty philosophy and dynamic ritual that dramatized it, impelling truths, and it became, as we shall see, the inciting motivation of the most rabid religious fanaticism. The massive instruction of or moral of this datum or episode in history has not been caught at any time. Its sensationality, enlightened lessons should be grasped now and never lost again. But it will still be pointed out and jibed at. How objectively the publication of Neoplatonic failed the world. It's failed the world, and how triumphant Christianity swept in to reach the masses whom Neoplatonics could not help. The jibe and the boast are precisely the two things which this work is designated to reveal in their bald falsity. It is the aim here to show just what the apparent failure of Neoplatonism and the apparent rampant triumph of Christianity actually meant to the latter course of history in calamity and woe. The matter is simply one point of view as to the value and significance of the failure and this triumph. It is a wholly unique view here, advanced with challenging data as proof that this failure of Neoplatonism and its resultant outcome in the upsurge of naive Christendom, in spite of much incidental good attributable to the latter in its history, constitute the direct catastrophe in the historical period. It can be readily shown that the same default of high mentality that led to the dissolitude of Neoplatonism, or its failure to lead the succeeding ages in culture, was the source spring of neoscience that produced the monstrous deity misguided zealotry known as Christianity. The absolutely is imminent, even indissoluble interrelational between the failure of Platonic revival and the outburst of pious but unphilosophical religiosity in the 3rd century is the prime text of this book, and needs infinite recognition and attention, for it determined the whole texture of succeeding history and has cast its gloomy shadow even down upon the events of history today. No one can comprehend the meaning of events in the world today, and religion is the open or hidden, well, usually hidden, cause of most events, who does not know the truth of what occurred back in those first centuries, when not even the more open republication of the sanctifying truths of the subliminal wisdom known to man availed to stop the swift rust of human thought from noblest balance and vision down into the various idiocy, turning its cryptical myths and dramas and its symbolic language into the fantastic parade of alleged history. This is the unspeakable tragedy we would depict. Even when later the arrant absurdities of literal interpretation drove the defenders to Hellenistic philosophy for saner elucidations of the scripture and creeds, it remains that the touch of popular religion is on the body of the esoteric arcana transformed into a terrible caricature and travesty of its real self. The anomaly of all histories that Christian writers have harped intermittently upon the fortunate escape of Christianity from the threat of being dominated by the same Hellenistic esoteric philosophy, and so losing its power to sweep the masses into hysteria and dementia. Likewise, they have with equal unanimity pictured the dire fate of Western civilization if the Greek wisdom systems later made the basis of Christian doctrinism itself, and now prized by high-breeded academic thinkers as the summa itself on human sagacity, and even exalted by such churchmen as Dean Inge, had come to dominate the thought life of Europe instead of the faith cult of a deadly regiment of ecclesiastical power. Nobody can say what history would have been under changed influences. One can only surmise with some flourish of logic, but at that it would be hard to find a system still determine the psychological destinies of millions so tied in knots and tangles of contradictory claims and logical inconsistencies and impossible historical avertments as it is this one called Christianity. What externally causes in Greek history combined to diminish interest in the lofty zealots of the Hellenistic mind must be left to the investigator of such things. It will always be a question whether the cause of decay inherent in the wisdom system themselves and the impact of outer events, or in the deterioration of the human quality after Plato. The great tide that lifted the Greek intellect to a mountain peak of lucid vision swept on by and left the world to sink back in a sorry state of deflation and jejunate philosophical interest. The Dark Ages had begun in the twilight following the bright day of Plato's reign, but it was 500 years before the dust darkened the night that gave birth to the dimension that then fastened itself like an obsessive mania upon the West for another direful 2,000 years. And his pronouncement seems too strong is enough in this main to justify it with a simple and irrefutable historical fact that the ecclesiastical of power that this darkened outlook generated absolutely clamped a chain upon the free use of the rational mind in the Western world for at least a millennia and a half. This is a statement of historical fact, freely made by many a professor in great universities in Europe and America today, an additional proof of the correctness in the single fact that in the brief period since the Occidental mind has liberated itself from that the strangling tyranny, it has made advances in science and general knowledge incomparably vast in comparison with all the gain made during the 1600 years of the ecclesiastical despotism. Indeed, that despotism has completely stagnated the course of European thinking. The free mind was stifled by the enforced rule of uncritical belief in imposed dogma. That monstrous tyranny stood with club in hand, ready to beat down every reappearance of independent thought action or any publication of solid scientific fact that would give the lie to its rigid dogmas based wearily upon a literal interpretation of the scripture. The investigation requires us to look now the world carried far down by the time of the 1st century AD. In the deep trough of the receding wave of Platonic uplift, there we must seek to locate the communicative causes of the Christian faith. It demands carefully scrutiny, and much of the data has been obliterated, I should say. When the great light of esoteric understanding had been almost completely extinguished, the Hellenistic world laid in a state of defenselessness, easily to be seduced by any religious appeal that might be made to it. A keen rationalist philosopher is the only, or the final guardian power able to save people from falling a prey to the irrational religious incalculations. And this steadily gyroscope was now in nearly total abeyance. The whole population lay fatally vulnerable to the influence of whatever cult fever might seize them at any moment. This situation, however, is by no means unique in world history. A replica of it extends at this present epoch. The complexion of things in this field of human history differs little from one age to another. In any age, there is found a vast and weird diversity of all sorts of religious cults, each expressing some phase of doctrinal or mystical or ceremonial infatuation. This is true of New York, Los Angeles, London today, as it was in Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus of the 1st century AD. Christianity itself started out not as a movement of a single group, but a ferment among a large number of different cults. There was a wide variety of divisions among them, including several diversifications of the Gnostics, who are accredited to the Christian movement, even if it heretically classified. Polonius and his Enneads, that is, it spends his scathing reprobation upon cults or cultists of a number of semi-philosophical, semi-mystical groups that remind one of such organization of today as Christian Science, New Thought, Unity, Divine Science, Spiritual Science, and the like. Each had doubtless caught some prominent aspect of philosophy and emphasized it to the exclusion of other necessities elements. This tendency to magnify one's facet of truth into a whole philosophy led to that limitation of a view which breeds bigotry and intolerance. Here has always lain the danger of religious ideologies and convictions. A half vision of truth entails almost certain bias, disproportion, error, and wreckage. In the systems of the great seers like Plato and Aristotle, the principle of disproportion was indeed the fatal factor, the wrecker of all true happiness and justice. Socrates came to define the good life as that is which all the elements of consciousness, indeed all things, were held related to each other in a certain exact measure and proportion. The golden mean between the two extremes was the path of wisdom leading to virtue and to happiness, the middle path. Every doctrine must be balanced in that pose between under and overemphasis that alone guarantees its rightness. Perhaps this is what at last the crucifixion of the Christ between two thieves can mean in its profoundly abstract sense. The force pulling on each side of any true view or position always steals something away from the truth. It robs the truth of its just measure and balance. This may mean little to the unreflective mind, but it is something that every deep thinking philosopher comes to realize, as Socrates did, namely that the truth always stands balanced on the narrow ridge between too much and too little. As courage is the golden mean between recklessness as excess and cowardice as deficiency, so true religion and the golden mean are exact balance between fanatical devotion as excesses and spiritual deadness as deficiency. Virtue is devotion to good, determined by intelligence and restraint from both extremes by the exercise of the utmost delicacy of understanding. All decisions fall in the midpoint between pro and con. People are unconscious of the operation of this principle in daily life. Yet it is the num of all decisions, all action as between right and wrong, prudent or reckless. The shrewd student comes at last to evaluate all historical movements in the light of this basis law. Nearly all historical events can be appraised as the result of the reaction of masses or individuals from excess to one direction to assess in its opposite. History is mostly a record of the swing of the pendulum, first too far towards the excessive zeal, then back too far over its incurving. Like so to say, gathers too much steam, then reduces it too sharply. The philosopher is the who strives to hold the balance even between the two poles. This is why Plato dramatized the chariot of life, driven by the driven by the noetic principles of higher intelligence as being drawn by two horses, to keep the two exactly even pace with the condition of happy motoring. End quote. Failure to do so is immense wreckage or the penalty of no advance. Weak people, undeveloped souls, do little but swing helplessly back and forth from violent action to equally violent reaction. The philosopher essayed to disregard the strong pulls in either direction and to hold the balance between them. He called upon reason, or his diviner faculty, to stem and curb the rabbit thrones of his emotional nature. This emphasizes the moral side of the great Greek philosophy, which asserting that in man there are the two natures, the animal and the human, and the divine and the human. Exhorted to the wise man to exalt the divine to rulership over the human so as to hold all elements in balance. Transferred to the area of religion, this high philosophy would dictate the control of emotionalism by divine reason. Lacking its presence and operation, religious movements have been just the procession of one emotional flare after another. The violence of the infatuation or hypnotization runs in exact proportion to the deficiency of philosophical knowledge. The less philosophical a movement is, the more religious it is. The world after Plato's day was filled with melange of religions that closely parallel those endless divisions of cults and sects found today. One springs from another in reaction or sharply differentiations. Each has sprung from the independent leadership of some one vigorous thinker. People become the sheep that follow some likely shepherd. But the leader, where did he pick up a system that would attract a following? You see, answer to this leads into the field of our proper searching. The truth is that each formulator of a system had made some contact, deep or shallow, with antecedent preachment. He had found brilliant light shining in some ancient document and saw that it would revitalize current low thinking. The real sources then trace back and back. Always research brings one face to face with the existence of a primordial revelation of initiative wisdom. Tradition postulates its having been vouchsafed in remote times from demigods to men. The scripture speaks of it having been an original dictation of God to holy men of old. This comports perfectly with the occult tradition. It is envisioned properly, meaning that holy men of old could embrace such exalted figures as Pythagoras and Plato, Hermes, Orpheus, Zoroaster, Krishna, and the Buddha. The question whether the dictating God was deity in some anthropomorphic shape or just the evolved divinity within the minds of such men is not too important. The presupposition that holy men of old, quote, were humans evolved to near divine status far better satisfy the human zeal for concrete understanding and provides a way viable to reason. Any other elaboration falls beyond human conception as to modus and agency. It is predictable that this all various schools stem by one line of successive propagation of another from a reverent system of high truth, delayed to early humanity. This can surely be assumed is that true religion, quote, true religion which already existed, end quote, from fathers antiquity that Augustine Avert came to be called Christianity in his day. These classifications are vital elements in the long lost story of the true origin of Christianity. It exemplifies how a unity of organic thought in the minds of demigods can and will be broken up into an endless diversity of segmentation as it passes through multiple minds of less and less keen vision. The gods see truth whole. Limited human mentality sees it only in parts. Religions are thus the facades of one primordial religion, some so badly distorted out of relation to the structural entirely as to this be hardly phases of truth at all. It takes profound and luminous forces of intellectual sight To integrate all rays into full original brilliance. The merging of all colors back into the white light demands the most rapid movement of thought sustained at high frequencies. The average human never possesses this heightened power. His religion, therefore, will always represent a partial view. He does not see life truly because he does not see it whole. It is the whole of philosophy. Is the work of the philosopher to see things not separately, but as elements related harmonically in a transient unity of structure, as Kant so firmly instead stated. What then was Christianity at its start? True history can now be written. It was a conglomerate, loose grouping of a number of various cults out of the total number of such in existence in the first century. The chief binding of unifying force subsisting between them was their tendency to emphasize a popularization of the varied tenets in the interest of mass edification as distinct from mystery cult elucidism. It was a movement inspired largely by resentment and revolt against the intellectual aristocracy. As before noted, it was a trend itself largely when rightly envisioned to extend more widely the participation of the common people in the deeper spiritual wisdom held in custody by the intelligentsia who handle the mysteries. It can be granted without too much dispute that by the time the mysteries had fallen in a low shape, to a low state of knowledge, refinement, and purity, naturally the receding waves of the grand photonic uplift had brought deterioration into the personnel intelligence of the mysteries. They were bound to suffer some the impact of the general depravity setting in upon the Hellenic world. Degradation may have crept in to reduce to revolting status some of the mystic rites of symbolic and dramatical character. Phallic symbolism and ritual dramatization created a process such as a formal part of Buddhism ceremonialism in the Orient can all too easily lose its elevating influence and slip into actual sensuality. Positive evidence on this score is none too conclusive, though the Christian level changes of the sort against the mysteries. At any rate, a popular revulsion sets in against them and popular leaders denounce them. Then a movement begins to take form to drag the arcane of the mysteries out to the common knowledge and to make the emeralds and rites understandable, end quote, to the people. Here's where catastrophe was invited. The terms on which alone mystery, doctrine, and ritual could be made, quote, comprehensible to simple minds, or the forms in which it would become understood, would be fabricated through the process of conversion of all allegory and drama into ostensibly objective fact and the taking of scriptural literature as history. This in the course of time was done, and no one has seen it, studied it, and traced its processes and calamitous effects more clear than Gerald Massey. So I'm going to conclude at this point of this video. There's still more left to read, and I will do that another day. So this is part 1 of the video here, approximately an hour long, and that's long enough for me today. So thank you for being here. Thank you for attending. May you have ears to hear and eyes to see, and may you also have the sense to understand the truth. All right. Take care. Have a good night.